Hello everybody, your favorite spiffy man here again to aimlessly discuss something that irks me. So to begin, I want to ask you a question. Are the definitions of the words we use subjective or objective descriptors of those words? And we're going to dig into that concept today. Ultimately, this discussion is a commentary on semantics, and to me at least, it seems as though people in general have a deep, seething disdain for semantics in a broad sense. On the one hand, I can fully understand these reservations. Often discussions of principle and ideals can be muddied or derailed when the conversations can't resolve the differences of semantic perception. And so what should be an interesting debate or discourse kind of devolves into individuals talking past one another, coupled with a side order of excessive emotional tensions. However, the semantics discussions are most decidedly important ones. If we cannot agree with one another on even the simplest definitions or the meanings of basic concepts, how can we expect reasonable discourse on ever more complex topics, ideas, principles, philosophies? If nothing else, the task becomes far more difficult, I think. So what is the ultimate cause for this kind of often intentional stalemate of miscommunication? Well, from the best of my estimation, the problem stems from the growing adoration of subjectivity within semantic discourse. You'll often hear individuals claim, well, that's my definition of X, Y, Z, or people correcting others with something along the lines of, well, that's not what that word means, or that's not how I define that word. However, I would ask whether or not this type of subjective approach to semantics isn't doing more harm than good. For example, we can look at the various labels that we ascribe to individuals based on large categorical classifications of political ideologies. Words like liberal, conservative, left-winger, right-winger, neocon, tradcon, neoliberal, progressive, alt-right, social liberal, classical liberal, libertarian, anarchist, wackadoodle wham-wham. What the actual hell do these classifications even mean anymore? Well, to even start unpacking that question, we first need to explore why we even apply these labels to groups at all. Now, without getting too deep into a kind of complex analysis of schematic application, we'll look into two primary utilities that are served by labeling groups. And first and most obviously, I think we ascribe political labels for the purpose of easy reference of someone's political positions on various points of principle and policy. It's far easier to say that person's a liberal than to go through each point of policy independently in a kind of, what's your position on abortion, immigration, marriage, the gays, so on and so forth. We as humans really love to categorize things to the simplest possible iteration that still makes sense in the interest of minimizing our own cognitive labor. However, where it seems that we start getting into trouble is when we start to look at individuals on the individual level, with all the nuance and logical inconsistencies between a label and a dissonant political philosophy. And we make an effort to apply a grand narrative or categorization or a political label to them without much success. What do we do with someone who doesn't seem to fit neatly into any specific little box? Furthermore, what do we do with individuals who are ideologically opposed to some of a group's ideas but not others? Well, it seems that we often attempt to force them into a group of best fit, and often with secondary, more nefarious intent. And this notion leads us to our second major utility for the language of labels: the means by which labels are applied for the purpose of kind of a pedestalization or defamation. And for this, you can think of all the ist categories that are thrown around all over the place. Racist, sexist, misogynist, populist, socialist, communist, nationalist, and so on. How often are these categorizations attached to individuals without the behavioral evidence that backs up the claim? Why are these labels ascribed in this haphazard type of way? Well, to me, it appears that often these labels are applied in an effort to discredit and defame. They're used as a type of ultimate final form character attack, where the accused racist, will say, is placed in a defensive position, having to argue that they're not racist, while the accuser assumes the undeserved kind of virtue-signaled moral high ground, claiming effectively, that's just what a racist would say, aha! So, on what are these claims based? In most cases, with a few exceptions, certainly not observable evidence of openly brazen racist behavior. So what is it? Well, overall, that question brings us back to the original question of semantics. How do we find a word like racist? Is it based on behavior? Is it based on the actions that a person takes? Should we base the definition on ideological or political narratives? How about majority group interpretation? What about scientific consensus? At any rate, it's difficult to say. A lot of people have very differing opinions on what definition we should use. But let's take a look at this. Take a look at this image. How would you describe it? Does the word diverse spring to mind at all? If it does, I may be able to reliably ascribe the ideological label of progressive leftist, or any number of other equally useless fucking buzzwords to you and your political ideology. But the argument could be made that some elements of the image do exemplify the concept of diversity. These women have differing hairstyles, body shapes, posture, and so on. But are we operating from the same foundational definition of the term diverse? And I would say likely not. As the title of the article from which this photo comes implies, this difference is kind of due to the fact that diverse and diversity has, in many narratives and ideologies, become synonymous with the phrase includes racial minorities. However, this definition is kind of in direct opposition to the more widely accepted definition of roughly a significant number of notably different characteristics. Therefore, by that definition, this image is not representative of a racially diverse group of individuals, as the group appears to be uniracial. So, on the one hand, you've got, look at this diverse photo, it's got people of color in it. On the other hand, you're like, yeah, but they're all people of color, so it's not racially diverse, because that's not the definition of diversity. And so, whose definition do we use? Do we allow a social ideology pushing a narrative to redefine words that already have an objective meaning? Is it a good thing to take a word like racism, which has long been defined as basically prejudice or discrimination based on race, and modify the word to have a different meaning in a subjective context, i.e., racism is racial prejudice plus power? And I don't think so. I can't agree with the addition of the power qualification within the definition of racism, and therefore the conversation from that point forward is basically founded on nothing. If an agreement can't be reached on the most fundamental concepts of a discourse, how can the discourse even be had in good faith? I really don't think it can. I personally don't especially care about your definition of a word, except insofar as we can establish an agreement on fundamental terms and concepts to move the discourse forward. I care about the definition of a word. I can make the claim that racism is defined as, the state of disliking turtles. If you don't like turtles, you're a racist. And I can use that as a subjective definition of the word racism. It would be silly and ignorant, and a lot of people would disagree with me, but I could do it, and an opponent would not be able to challenge that idea, that definition, if we have agreed on a position of subjective definition. That's my definition of racism. However, how do I now escape the trap of claiming the superiority of my definition of the term? Well, I feel like overall we kind of need an arbiter of sorts in the vein of an objective decider of the meaning of words. And I would argue that the determinant of meaning lie in the type of court of public opinion. How does the average person utilize this word in everyday speech? As the random working jackass from Nebraska using the sociological definition of racism with the power qualifier, which changes its application a great deal. Or they have basically evoking behaviors that embody racially based discrimination, some like Jim Crow or the Klan or the Nazis, tangible things that can be observed in the real world. They're thinking of actions rather than some ideological notion of power politics. So I truly feel like we have to come to terms with the standardization of terms. However, if you look to many ideological groups, efforts are constantly being made to separate words like sex and gender into unique terms with unique definitions. Whereas before this effort, the terms were synonymous, effectively, in mainstream discourse. In this regard, it seems as though these types of groups are meddling with the cultural zeitgeist in an effort to force the objective, everyday use of terminology to operate in favor of their own political narrative. And it's something that I think George Orwell would have been proud of. But don't get me wrong. I understand that throughout history and over time, terminology gets kind of conflated with other types of colloquial speech, and it evolves into a new, widely accepted definition and has a new meaning. But to make an effort to force these evolutions of language in an inorganic way is, in my opinion, pretentious at best and tyrannical at worst. So where does this leave us? Most people can agree on what they mean when we say sky or road. But how do we continue a debate or a discussion when we cannot agree on the definition of oppression? How do we as a society continue operating when we're constantly hefting disingenuous labels upon individuals with no real basis beyond, you're not on my team, therefore you're evil and I must tear you apart? Blanket categorizations like liberal and conservative have been reduced to basically pejoratives with which to cudgel opponents and draw intense straw man attacks. More extreme labels like alt-right and progressive left now amount to accusations of heresy with highly dogmatic fervor in an effort to kind of elicit and enforce the excommunication of an individual from a position of morality. If you subscribe to this thought process, I can apply this to you, and you are now an immoral person. Alright? But does it even matter? The words, the terms, these labels, they mean absolutely nothing anymore. They used to. But if everyone who disagrees with you is alt-right, then no one is. If everyone to the right of Karl Marx is basically a fascist, then how do we categorize the really bad people? Words have to mean things to be effective, and ultimately, previously powerful words have been so diminished by misuse so as to lose any credibility at all. And as a result of all this, how can we expect reasonable discourse? However, those that perpetuate this blatant breakdown of language into meaningless platitudes of forced virtue signaling and moral superiority will also, in my opinion, ultimately become the biggest casualties of this culture war. Rational, evidence-based discourse kind of lurks in the shadows, secretly winning the hearts and minds of individuals as the ideological superpowers kind of bludgeon each other with lies and flare and flash. Why? Because words have to mean things. Consensus must be reached. Compromises must be made, lest we all become slaves to identitarians in the end. So be careful when you choose your words. Thanks for hanging out. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, share it around. Love you guys. Peace.